I want to talk to you this morning about one of the most important aspects that we experience in our society today of getting the other journey of following Jesus right. I've titled it Keeping It Clean, and you'll see where that goes in just a minute. You know, if you take a look at virtually any of the animals that you encounter during the course of your day, say for instance your cat, your dog, that late blooming mosquito that snuck into the house, the moth by the porch light, the goldfish in the fish bowl, or the birds in the backyard. In each case, you're going to see what biologists refer to as bilateral symmetry. Great big long phrase that simply means that most animal forms and many plant forms have two sides that are mirror images of each other. Look in the mirror and you'll see your own bilateral symmetry, or at least as close as your face managed to come to it. Two eyes, two nostrils, two ears, even your teeth sort of spread out in matching sets. It's amazing how much of a difference it makes that God gave us two of certain things. Let's say, for instance, eyes and ears, instead of just having one. And I'm no expert on eyes, but I do know this, that the two eyes that we have are spaced far enough apart that they actually give us two views of the same thing that we're looking at. So that actually, if you were to hold your thumb out in front of you and close one eye and look at and point your thumb at something, and then wink and close the other eye, you're going to see that your thumb isn't pointing at the same thing you were looking at when you were looking at it through the first eye. Your eyes angle in just a little bit, and the result is that two eyes let you see in 3D. That's why we take for granted the fact that we can see the world in 3 dimensions instead of just as a flat panel in front of us. Same is true with your sense of hearing. Your two ears work together so that you can locate sounds in 3 dimensions all around you. Nice big word for how that works would be complementarity. Not compliment, as when you give someone a compliment, but complement, meaning that two different things, or two different people, two different objects work together to a common goal. Of course, your eyes are supposed to do that all the time. You don't want your eyes each going off and doing its own thing. You want them to focus on the same thing, but in a slightly different way. And the result is that we see better than we ever would if we had only one eye. In fact, our entire bodies are made to complement every organ, to complement all of the others. There's a level of commitment that goes with your body that you take for granted. When you look at something, for instance, if I say, let's all look out that window, both of your eyes obediently go in that direction. Unbidden. I mean, they've learned to do that ever since you were very, very little. Both focus on the same thing that you happen to be looking at. If not, you're going to have blurry vision, double vision. You're going to start having headaches. You're going to be visiting the optometrist very quickly because the world isn't functioning for you the way it's supposed to, and it's hard to find yourself in that world. You can just practice by doing what this next lady is doing. Yeah. Try that for like 5 minutes and see how your head feels. Your eyes weren't made to do that. They're made to work together. Now, I share this idea of parts of our bodies functioning in a complementary way. Because when we read the creation story in the book of Genesis, we discover that God created human beings to complement each other in very special ways as we fulfill our mission to reflect who God is back into this world. I'll read to you from the Message, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created human beings. He created them God-like, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female. Just as God gave the eagle not one, but 2 wings so that it could fly, and just as He gave us not one, but 2 eyes so that we could see in 3 dimensions, He also created human beings, male and female, so that we could reflect who God is in the fullest and richest possible way. Just take a minute to think about how profound this little verse is. It's certainly telling us, first of all, that There is no order between males being more of the image of God and females less, or vice versa. It is a both and. He created human beings. He created them with this thing we call gender. And somehow the two genders, the two sexes, need to work together to bring the fullest picture of who God is into his world. Gender, in other words, is a foundational part, not just of who we are, but of how God intended us to represent him in this world. Gender is a God-given reality. The very beginning of the story of how humans came to be, from the biblical perspective, starts with God creating people with gender. Gender, then, is not something that we make up. It is not just something that we choose for ourselves. However confusing this subject may seem to be, at the biological level, we typically find that females have 2 X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y, just a trace of what Genesis was talking about at the very beginning of the story. So when males and females together focus on God, like the left eye and the right eye focusing in on the same object, and when males and females together allow God to shine through them in this double picture that they've created, the whole creation sees a richer reflection of God himself. As we read a little further in Genesis, we discover why 2 are so much better than 1. I'll take you to verse 28, the next verse in that passage. Genesis 1:28, the Message. God blessed them. Prosper, reproduce, fill earth, take charge. Be responsible for fish in the sea and birds in the air, for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. As we well know, it would only be by men and women coming together that humans could be recreators themselves. That's how it comes to be that we are able to reproduce and fill the earth. And as it turns out, there's only one command that God ever gave the human race, that the human race has consistently obeyed. To the tune of some 7 billion people at this point, we have figured out a way to fill the earth and reproduce. But it has always taken both the male and the female component for us to become, to the greatest extent, those creators or procreators, if you will, that show who God is by ourselves bringing God reflectors into this world. Now, the creation story reaches its climax when God brings the male and the female, the 2 halves of the human race, together as a married couple. And if you read chapter 2 in the book of Genesis, at the very end, the story concludes with these words. Genesis chapter 2, 24 and 25. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and embraces his wife. They become one flesh. The 2 of them, the man and his wife, were naked, but they felt no shame. We can learn a lot from these last little verses about God's intention for us as we, male and female, complementing each other, bring God's reality into this world. First of all, the male-female complementarity is meant to make us one flesh. Think, for example, about your left eye and your right eye. They are different, and they see the world differently, and they give your brain a slightly different angle on things. But if we were to actually examine left and right eye, we would find that they are literally one flesh. They all came from the same embryo. They all came from the same stem cells that developed. And here we are now with 2 eyes that are totally connected with each other. They belong together. We don't swap eyes out, say, oh, you're having trouble seeing that here, use mine. It doesn't work like that. Secondly, when God intended that when a man and a woman join their lives together, they would become one flesh. Unique, individual, each responsible for their relationship with God, each an image bearer, and certainly for single people, for divorced people, for people who may never be married, all of us are equally, in that individual sense, image bearers that reflect who God is. But there is a unique calling when God does bring that person of the opposite sex into our lives, and we form that committed relationship whereby we become one flesh. And we're meant to function sort of like your 2 eyes are doing right now, or your 2 ears are doing right now. taking in the world from a unique perspective, but putting the focus together on Him. We see that this male-female complementarity is to be celebrated in a joyful sexual relationship, one that affirms who we are and never brings either party shame. When my two eyes look at something, there isn't this little dialogue, even though probably one eye is probably stronger than the other. One is dominant. I'm left-handed. I also use my left eye more than the other one. But my eyes aren't having a contest. They don't call each other names, and they don't sort of rob resources one from the other. They work together. And if one becomes ill, the other one can pick up the slack. Third, our male-female complementarity provides both biologically and spiritually the means for being fruitful and multiplying. How sacred, then, is this gift of sexuality, of gender, of being male or female? How sacred is that? Why, it is the way that God provided for us to produce people in His image. Instead of Him just saying, well, I'll leave that to myself, I'll just keep making image bearers, He delegated that to us. Is it any wonder then that sexuality comes under attack? That even gender issues now come under question? Because if any being or any society wants to derail what God has created, that would be the place to start. And how things go wrong when we misuse or even misunderstand our sexuality. Instead of complementing each other, we take advantage of each other. Or we spend our sexual energy on our own gratification. Or we break our promises and we break faith with the person that we've committed to, and then cause hurt and suffering that goes down through the next generations if we have children or grandchildren that are affected. No wonder then that Paul issues such a stern set of commands regarding how we handle our sexuality when we embark on this other journey of following Jesus. Now please hear me very carefully here. I am talking to you from the words of Paul that are written for people who identify themselves with Jesus as being on another journey. So these words are very powerful for us, but as Paul would say in other places, you can't just automatically apply these words to people who are not on the other journey and expect them to get it and expect them to agree, because the whole premise of their lives is oriented around other things, very often around idolatries involving things like sexuality. But for you and me, those of us who are following Jesus, whatever our current condition or state or relationships, listen to what Paul says, Ephesians 5 verse 3. But among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Well, three terms: sexual immorality, uncleanness, and greed. Sexual immorality is a term that speaks to things like adultery, having sex with prostitutes. It comes from the word porneia, which gives us the word porn or pornography. Uncleanness or impurity is a term that was typically used in those days to denote unrestrained sexual behavior. If you do any sort of a study of the Roman world of Paul's time, you will find that there are things engraved and pictures that were created that you would not want to leave out on your coffee table. Greed. Well, in this context, this concept of greed points to unrestrained sexual greed, such as lusting after somebody else's spouse. This is the word that is used in connection with that idea of not coveting after your neighbor's wife. In each case, Paul is warning against what happens when people turn the mirror of their souls away from the Creator and focus it on sex and desire for its own sake. Inevitably, what happens is that there is hurt and shame. There are broken relationships, lives that never become what God intended them to be. Probably every one of us can think back at some point in our lives to thoughts we have thought, or things we have done, or relationships we have been in that we wish we could go back and, sort of scrub out of the record. Things that didn't go well because somehow, whether intentionally or accidentally, or maybe we were tricked into something, or maybe we just were full of ourselves, we got off the path, and when we did, things didn't go well. And Paul is saying, don't even begin to go there. He even goes so far as to say, don't even joke about those kinds of things. Don't talk about them. Don't make them part of your thought life. Look what he says in verse 4. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. The dirty joke at the water cooler may seem harmless enough, but does it feed a process of minimizing the danger of wandering away from the right path? You know, it's funny how the television show and the little the innuendos and the little jokes and the little things that you don't want to have to explain to your kids because it really is not appropriate. Those sort of things prepare us for the culture that we become, 5 years later? Usually it's done in the sitcom. Usually it's done around the joke, and it's just funny, and no, we don't really think that way, and no, we would never do those things, but we can laugh about them. Well, you laugh about it at one point, and joke about it at one point, and then it ceases to be quite as shocking, and it ceases to be quite as scandalous, and then after a while you find that there are people doing those kinds of things, and then all of a sudden, it's kind of like that joke that we've always told, and ha, 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 and after a while, this becomes the new normal. Paul says God's people are people on another journey, people who are captivated by how good and how wonderful God is. If they're married, then they are in a relationship that permits them to celebrate that sexuality, celebrate it in a way where they can be thankful for a gift from God. That means that sex is not their God, it's God's gift. And for those of us who are not in a place where we are currently in a marriage relationship, for many of you, God has that blessing for you. And this is a time of preparation, a time to say no to making sex the God, or to try to use sex to reel in some person that will be the person of your dreams. And to thank Him. Thank Him, first of all, that life is more than just sexual pursuit. Thank Him that He gives us all good things. You will never reflect who God is if you indulge in sexual immorality and lust for a person who is not yours. You'll never reflect who God is if you pursue sex for sex's own sake, turning it into a substitute God. And here we have some of Paul's strongest words on the subject, verse 5. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man as an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Ouch. Those are strong words. Those are very strong words for a society such as ours. A society where just about anything goes. Where immorality itself seems like an old-fashioned term. Where uncleanness or impurity has been replaced by the anything goes attitude. Where you're not greedy, you're just playing the game. But bad things happen to people, to real people, not TV characters, not the phony faces on the People magazine or Us magazine, but the real people behind those airbrushed faces. Bad things happen to us when we turn away from God's plan, particularly in the area of our sexuality. Think about what happens when your left eye and your right eye refuse to work together. Oh, it's fun to cross our eyes for a second, but what if they get stuck that way? What if the muscles on one side for one eye refuse to respond to the commands from the brain and that eye becomes lazy or begins to drift away? What's life like then? Oh, you can see, but it's a lot of work. Or maybe you end up wearing the patch, or maybe you have to get these corrective glasses to try to pull that eye back, but it's a lot of work. It's not the joyful, thankful experience that you were taking for granted when both eyes were tracking the way they were supposed to and focusing the way they were supposed to. Don't kid yourself. Just because some smarty pants makes a movie or makes a television show in which everybody breaks all the rules and they live happily ever after, don't kid yourself that real life works like that. They're selling something. They're selling something, a movie to begin with. They're selling personalities. They're selling a vision of the future that doesn't work. It doesn't work now. It's never worked in the past. It will not work in the future. It is not what you would want for your children. It is certainly not what you should want for yourself or your spouse or your future mate. And it certainly is not anything that God will affirm when we stand before Him and give account for our lives. This is serious stuff. This is serious stuff. And in our culture, we are taught in every single minute, every waking moment you live, to minimize what God says about our sexuality, to redefine it, to basically leave the Creator out of the picture and say, thank you very much, we can figure out how we're supposed to work. So how do we keep things clean? How do we keep the mirror of our soul clean? The window, if you will, of our soul clean, so that we can see God clearly and reflect Him, especially when it comes to our sexuality. Well, I would say the best word in the world is the word celebrate. Solomon, the writer of Proverbs, points the way to celebrate our sexuality. Proverbs 5, verses 15 to 19 in the Message, particularly for those of us who are blessed with a married partner. Verse 15 says, "Do you know the saying, drink from your own rain barrel, draw water from your own spring-fed well? It's true. Otherwise, you may one day come home and find your barrel empty and your well polluted. Your spring water is for you and you only, not to be passed around among strangers." Verse 18, "Bless your fresh flowing fountain. Enjoy the wife you married as a young man. Lovely as an angel, beautiful as a rose. Don't ever quit taking delight in her body. Never take her love for granted." What a celebration. To look, if God has brought a mate into your life, to look at that person, even though you may be working on some of the issues of being together and of learning how to focus together and how to do life together, look at that person and say, instead of making jokes, instead of going around the dark side of things, I choose to be thankful. I choose to say, Lord, this is this wonderful opportunity you provided, not just for us to find happiness, not just for us to learn how to bless each other, but for us together to bring a picture of who you are in 3D into a world that needs to see you. The other journey, when it comes to our sexuality, is not for the faint of heart. It's the journey of learning how to follow Jesus, the King, into His kingdom. It's the journey in which our sexuality comes under His rule. That may be the hardest part of all. Realizing that we do say no to our sexuality. Guys, when you know that with a click of the button and a few sweeps of the mouse, you can access all of the filth you could ever possibly imagine, you need to learn to say no. If you can't say no, you need to go get help so you can say no. The computer's not going to clean itself up. The internet is not going to some morning be free of all sorts of pornography and just be this wonderful place where Bible verses come up every time you turn on your computer. It's not going to happen. And guys, when you're walking around and you see a young lady and you could take 2 more looks or 3 more looks, you need to say no. God put us in charge of where eyes go. Job talks about making a covenant with his eyes, not to look lustfully upon a woman. Ladies, you face your own temptations. They may or may not be of the visual variety. They may be temptations of the heart. They may involve just beginning conversations and feeling drawn into that conversation with this person other than your mate and finding that fulfillment for your heart and your soul. They may be following certain stories that go on interminably and involve all sorts of rule breaking from God's point of view. Learn to say no. Learn to say, Jesus, I want to walk with you on this new path. God's called us to the other journey, the journey in which we become holy and pure like Him. It's a journey in which we celebrate sex the way He intended it to work. It's a journey in which we learn to tune ourselves to our mate as part of a lifelong calling to more and more reflect God's image in all His beauty and love, all of His rightness, all of His justice. And if we're not married, we save ourselves and our sexuality for that future spouse, or we live out a calling to be single. Remember, Jesus was never married, but was and is the perfect reflection of the invisible God. Whatever the case, we're called to keep it clean when it comes to our sexuality. And that means reserving our sexuality for a committed, complementary, and nowadays we have to say, heterosexual relationship. It means refusing to make sex a god or an idol. It means refusing to use or lust after others, or even joke about things that are revolting to our Creator. And most of all, it means being thankful for all that God brings into our lives, especially that gift of another human being made in His image who will share life's journey, but always from a slightly different angle, and thus allow us together to bring God in 3D to our world. Let's bow our heads together and ask that the band would come up at this time. As you bow your head, I would assume each one of us relates to what Paul says in a different way, coming from a different background, different experiences. And this is what I want you to do. I just want you to take a moment to invite God's Holy Spirit to converse with you about where you're at in this aspect of learning to follow Jesus. If you're not a follower of Jesus, then that's the question that you can think about, and perhaps we'll think about whether or not this is the time that you begin that journey of following Him. Those of us who have made that commitment, sometimes we need to hit the reset button. Take a look at what we think and how we act, and measure that against who God really is. This Creator who created us, male and female, to shine His presence into this world. Just take a moment with Him. And if you are married, I want to ask you to thank God right now for that partner. Whether things are hunky-dory at this point in your marriage, or whether you're working on issues, or maybe it's a very difficult time, the road forward begins with saying, thank you, Lord. Thank you. Thank you for this person. Thank you for the work that you want to do in each of us. Those of you who are single, divorced, those of you who are not yet in a committed relationship, I just want to encourage you, put your eye on the Lord first and let His gifts follow in as He walks you into that new place of freedom. It may well be that He's doing a work right now that will prepare you beyond your wildest dreams for the blessing that He has before you. You and He will figure out what that looks like. But I want to encourage you to join Him and trust Him in keeping it clean. And Father, I pray that You would work in our hearts to make us not a judgmental people, not a holier-than-thou people, but down-to-earth, ordinary human beings who have Your Spirit in some amazing way living inside of us. And to the extent that we experience and celebrate our sexuality at all, it becomes one more powerful and beautiful way to show just how good and how wonderful You are. We give You thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand together, ask our prayer team to come down, and certainly invite you to stick around afterwards. If you have a prayer need, we'd love to pray with you before we all go out back. Let's sing.